Hi, and welcome to the 2020-2021 Law Firm Interview Workshop. Today, we're going to discuss strategies, skills, and techniques for preparing for on-campus interviews. My name is Rob Kakasi, and I'm joined by my colleague, Amy Maddock. We're executive directors in the Office of Career Strategy. We're going to talk today about strategies for preparing for screening interviews, typically the first in a round of interviews in the private sector. Before we jump into some of the strategies, we wanted to start with an image. And it's of an extremely busy business person, who may not have a ton of time to prepare very intimately for the meeting that they're about to have. And it probably isn't surprising that we're trying to suggest that this may be the interviewer who's sitting across from you virtually on the day of your interview. Attorneys may be doing multiple interviews that day. A typical slate of interviews is 21 candidates. So if they're doing the full slate, you're one of 21 on the day of OCI. They may be at multiple schools interviewing in a given week. And never mind that they have their regular slate of attorney responsibilities to do. They may be ignoring dozens of emails, if not hundreds, during the course of a day. The fact that they're doing it from home may mean they have children or other caretaking responsibilities from around the house. It just may be a frenetic time for them. We want you to keep this in mind because I think it means two things for you as you prepare for these interviews. First, it may be difficult to stand out in this environment. There's a lot of other people interviewing in a very crowded time of the year. And second, you may be facing an interviewer who's not incredibly prepared with your file, right? Who's not sort of there, primed and ready to bring the best out of you. So it really is your job to get the best out of yourself. Okay, so Amy's going to talk a little bit about our roadmap and how we're going to get started today.
Thanks, Rob. So something to kind of keep in mind as you go through this little webinar is that interviewing is not an innate skill. It is a learned behavior. And what we're going to do today is teach you the tools that you need to sort of create that behavior in yourself. So our presentation today is particularly applicable to law firm interviews, although a lot of the advice, the general advice that you'll hear is applicable more broadly than that. And we're tailoring our advice to a virtual platform, which is what you're going to be encountering during this upcoming recruiting season if you haven't already. Every interview will be different, but again, we're trying to present you with the tools that you'll need to be ready for whatever is thrown at you and be as best prepared as you possibly can. And we suggest that you use this this webinar in conjunction with our interviewing website, especially the interviewing guide, which Rob is going to demonstrate.
This is how you find our website. It's under the job search toolkit, the interviewing tab. It's got a lot of resources that are regularly updated. And here's what it looks like live. A host of resources, including a newly prepared interviewing remotely tips for virtual interviews that we think will be helpful.
So what we're going to talk about today is basically your roadmap for a successful interview experience. So you could think about the interview experience in 3 stages: before, during, and after the interview. And we'll talk about all 3 of these today. But some things to keep in mind is that before the interview, preparation is key. This is where you do your research, you think about your brand and what you bring to the table, and you start to prepare answers to some of the questions that you'll get asked. And you practice by using mock interviews. So really preparation is very important before the interview. Prepare your production. You'll see that under before the interview. What that basically means is, we mentioned the fact that these interviews are going to be virtual interviews. So think about your space and think about how you present yourself on a virtual platform. And we'll talk about that a little bit more a little later on. But it is important to know yourself, know your resume, research the firm, and practice your interviewing skills. During the interview, you want to put your best foot forward. And so we'll talk about what you can expect. We can talk about the types of questions that you may expect to be or asked, I'm sorry. You will talk about basic tips for taking the interview and for standing out in a positive way among the slate of candidates that the interviewers are meeting with. And then we'll also talk about some potential pitfalls and how you can confront those and pivot those pitfalls to a more positive highlight of your experience and skills. And then after the interview, we'll talk a little bit about following up and what to expect in terms of a timeline and how to, how to contact the recruiter if you're curious about where your application stands.
Great. So before handing it back to Amy to talk about the preparation piece, we want to use some more images to maybe ground your mindset going into the interview. And the image we want you to have is of a prepared, poised, calm, on top of things professional, who's ready to advocate for their client. And in this case, the client is you. You want to be making the best case for yourself about why you fit and how you'll add value to the firm or whatever employer you're applying to. You want to avoid the salesy aspect of things where you're a little bit over the top, a little bit too aggressive in making the case for yourself, and leaving them perhaps with a bad taste in their mouth. So, for those listening who believe that interviewing is really about bragging about yourself or, sort of putting yourself in the center stage for something, we want you to think of it differently. We want you to think of it as an advocacy exercise where you're there to sort of make the best case about why you should be hired.
So we talked in the previous slide in our roadmap about preparation. And the first little bullet under preparation was know thyself. And I think this one is a little tricky for students because students feel, what we find when we do mock interviews with students is that I think a lot of times students feel as though they know how they would answer certain questions that they might get asked in an interview, like, why did you come to law school? Or why do you want to be a lawyer? Tell me about yourself. These are open-ended questions that are designed to be softballs and to make you feel comfortable in the interview setting, but they sometimes trip students up because when you answer the question in your head, you sound very, very eloquent. But when it comes time to saying it in an interview, a lot of times students tend to ramble or they think, you know what, I'm not exactly sure why I came to law school. Or so this is the part of the interview preparation where you really start to engage in a little bit of self-assessment. So start by asking yourself some of the open-ended questions that we have listed here, like, why did you come to law school? Or why do you want to be a lawyer? Tell me about yourself. Why do you want to work for a law firm? Why are you interested in our firm? These are all questions that you can expect to be asked either explicitly or implicitly throughout the interview. So take a little bit of time and think about how you would answer them. Tell me about yourself is a question that I think is a really great opportunity for you to highlight things about you that are unique. Your path to law school. You could talk about your family, work experience. This is a real opportunity for you to start to develop your brand. As we note here, embedded in all of these questions is, why should we hire you? And so that's sort of the underlying question throughout the entire interview. So have an agenda for answering. We'll talk a little bit later on about the idea of having a 3-point agenda, but the basic concept of that is thinking about 3 things about you that if all else fails, you want the interviewer to remember, and then crafting your answers so that they target and harken back to those 3 points. It helps you develop a brand, and it helps the employers remember you out of the stack of resumes that they're going to be seeing throughout the day. You might also want to take some time and interview yourself, right? Take a critical look at your resume. Look at your resume through the eyes of the employer. Anticipate questions that you might get and spot gaps on your resume. I mean, if you took some time off between college and law school, think about how you will talk about that. Anticipate questions about your summer work, particularly this past summer, and any legal issues that you've worked on. You can expect that employers may ask a lot of questions about your 1L summer experience, since that's the most recent and relevant work experience that you've had. So make sure that you can talk comfortably and confidently about the work that you did and what you learned. And also make sure to Google yourself. You want to know what's out there on the internet about you, and you want to You may want to take a look at your Facebook and Instagram and Twitter privacy settings and adjust them as necessary. You can see on the slide here, we have two exercises that we suggest that you take part in. The first is brainstorming answers to the questions you may be asked, which we link to from our website. Practice those answers out loud, and you may want to consider, before you even practice the answers out loud, writing out short bulleted answers to those questions so that when the question is asked of you, the bullets pop in your head and you have a framework for a strong answer. And then also, as I mentioned before, analyze your resume from the interviewer's perspective. What would you want to ask yourself about? And be aware that anything that's on your resume is fodder for conversation. So make sure that you study it closely and feel comfortable talking about everything on it.
Thanks. So, of course, want to know yourself and what you bring to the table, and you'll want to know a lot about the employer as well. Researching employers is critical. And I think, especially important in a market that may be a little bit tighter for 2021, consider how many of the reasons for wanting to be at a firm or how many of your research points are portraying you as a provider of a service versus a consumer of a service. How many of the reasons that you want to work somewhere are about contributing versus what you'll get from it? So do think about that as you tick through your research. We have a resource there. It's hyperlinked to how to research firms, about being informed about what firms offer, what their specialties are, how they train their talent, how they serve their clients. We think that's important. What's vital, though, is to start winnowing down whatever reasons you have to be you want to be at a firm, to a reason you want to be at the specific firm that you're interviewing with. Firms more than ever want to feel like you are interested in working there specifically. So what can you do to show them that there are attributes of the firm particular to them, or when taken together particular to them, make that firm the right fit for you? And then finally, how can you incorporate some of the research that you've done into the interview? Clearly, you want to shape your answers so that you can show some of the research you've done, but you may want to shape your questions to do the same. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But an approach we think tends to work pretty well is to sort of distill all of these pieces of work that you've done into an approach we call the constellation approach. So that is, what is the variety of factors, the constellation of factors that when taken together mean that the firm you're talking to is the firm for you? So for example, if you were to speak to a firm and say, well, I really want to do litigation and I want to stay in DC, you could be talking about literally dozens of firms that are coming to OCI. There are not enough factors there in your constellation to make that firm feel special and specific. But if you start integrating things that are particular to the firm about, say, their mentorship program, the type of clients that they serve, the way that they assign work, you might start touching upon things that, when taken together, make that firm particular to your interests. So think about your constellation approach and how you're putting factors together when you're answering these types of questions.
As we said before, practice makes perfect. And so part of your interview preparation is practicing your answers to some of the questions that you can expect to be asked. And one way to do that is to do a mock interview. Now, some of you may have already done mock interviews with employers over the course of the fall, and that's fantastic. We hope it was a helpful experience. For those of you who have not done mock interviews with employers or who would like to get additional interviewing experience, we encourage you to sign up to do a mock interview, excuse me, with an OCS or grad programs advisor. We will be on hand to do practice interviews. We do dozens of these each year, and it's really our job to help you put your best foot forward and to give constructive critique to help you sharpen and hone your interviewing skills. So we strongly recommend signing up to do a practice interview, probably with an advisor that's not your own. But that's something that we would encourage you to do over the next several weeks. You may also practice with family members and friends over the holidays, especially if there's a question that you're just not sure how your answer hits. You might practice with your family while you're home and just say, hey, can you help me think about my answer to this question? Warm up. And what we mean by the warm up is, spend some time really thinking about how you want to sell yourself, how you want to present your skills and experience. And as I mentioned before, write out some bulleted answers to some of the questions that you might be asked, so that when you're in that interview and you're nervous and you're in the middle of a conversation, when you get asked a question, the bulleted answers pop up in your head. You have a framework, you have a structure for the question, and you can feel confident in your answer because you've given it some thought and you're not unprepared. Um, and then we also suggest that for each employer that you're interviewing with, you might want to consider completing this interview preparation worksheet, which you can find on our interviewing website, and which is incredibly helpful in keeping you organized for each interview that you have. So just walking you through it briefly, you would write the name of the firm that you're interviewing with at the top, and then think about the three things that about you that would be of particular interest to this specific firm, right? So if they're a firm that specializes in transactional law and you spent 2 years before law school, as a paralegal in a capital markets practice, that would be something that maybe you would want to highlight. So think about, why you, and if necessary, and if you're able to, tailor it to this specific firm. And then think about why them. Why do you want to work for this firm? As Rob mentioned before, these firms are all unique and different, and they are meeting with lots of students and really want to know what in your mind stands out about them. Why do you want to work specifically for them as opposed to another firm? So take the time to really think about that. And then, think about what questions you have for them. We do have samples on our website, which are really helpful in sort of thinking through the types of things that you might want to ask of the firm. And then if there are any areas of concern that you think you may have, you might write those down and then write a little bullet about how you plan to address that during the course of the interview. We'll talk about grades a little bit later in this presentation, but this is someplace where, if your grades are slightly lower than the stated median for a particular firm, and you think that could be an area of concern, you might want to write that down and then think about how you plan to sort of address that and point to other aspects of your candidacy that make you particularly strong. Prepare your production. We mentioned this before. We think, the OCI interviews and the callback interviews are going to be virtual. At least the ones organized by Georgetown will be. And we think that it's likely that the virtual format is here to stay. So at least for some period of the interview process. So get as familiar as possible with the interview platform that you're using at each particular stage. Georgetown will be using Intern X as the host for our screening interviews. And we will be sharing tutorials on how to use it. It's very easy as a student to log in and to familiarize yourself with the platform. But law firms may be using other platforms to host their callbacks. So take some time and watch the demo videos once you know what platforms you'll be using for callbacks, so that you are familiar with how the system works and you know what to do on the day of the interviews. Turn off your computer alerts, turn off email alerts, turn off texting if you get them on your computer. Turn off all of your alerts so that you can be singularly focused on the interview in front of you. Try to minimize interruptions. Try to find a quiet space that's removed from activity. But you know what? In this day and age, one thing that the working virtually during a pandemic has shown us all is that we're all human. We have kids, roommates, pets that show up periodically on calls, and viewers understand that. In fact, they may have those same interruptions. So there's only so much that we can control. Acknowledge the interruption and then move on. Don't let the interruption dominate or derail your interview. Laugh about it, acknowledge it, and then just move on. You may want to have your phone nearby in case your internet connection is lost. If If it's lost during OCI, we are asking the employers to call you at the number that you list on your resume. So again, keep your phone alerts off, but have it nearby in case you lose your internet connection and the interviewer needs to call you. Rob mentioned before, we have some really great tips on our interviewing website on how to interview remotely. You might spend some time kind of taking a look at some of our suggestions. We talk a little bit about what sort of background you might want to have, where to place the camera, what to wear. Make sure that you wear business attire on both the top and the bottom. And we have other tips on there as well. So it's well worth your time to spend a few minutes going through how to interview remotely.
Let's give you a sense of what it looks like and feels like to be in the room. And we're going to start with what we think the firm might be looking for based on the many conversations we've had with recruiters and hiring partners at law firms. So what the firm's looking for, another way to think about this is, how can you help them, right? Again, the why should I hire you questions embedded in a lot of what's going to go on in the room. Even if it's not explicitly stated, it might be what they take away from the conversation. So we've tried to break this down for you into a few categories as you prepare that agenda that Amy was speaking about earlier. And the first category you might think about is technical skills. Now, certainly they want bright people. And the fact you go to Georgetown means you've got a leg up on a lot of the competition already. You're really bright. You go to a great law school. But there's going to be a lot of people at great law schools who are interviewing. So how can you show that you have the intelligence, the legal ability to add value at the firm? And pointing to grades is one barometer of that, but there are many other facets of this that you might want to think about unpacking. Writing is so important for a lot of what lawyers do, more so in some practices than others. So think about, if writing is not the key technical competency, what is, and how can you show it? If you have some language abilities, that may be important for certain types of practices. So you can unpack that with them for a little bit. And then any law school, pre-law school experience or experience over the summer, an externship that gave you some substantive grounding in the work that you're saying you want to do could be really helpful to highlight. So you might go with a technical skills bucket to lead off your agenda. You'd certainly want to have some element of professional skills in that agenda. The firms are hiring you to do a job, to own a project and to really see it through to completion. They're not delegating work to you, as an exercise solely for your growth. They're delegating work to you because they need to know an answer. They need to know it usually quickly and really well. So do you show good judgment? Are you sort of motivated internally? Do you have a passion to do this work? Communication, because you're working on teams, sometimes across offices, across time zones, is really important, across generations and cultures you'll want to highlight. And one that we've seen more and more recently is, do you have a business mindset? Firms are in the business of business because their clients are relying on them as trusted advisors to advance business interests. So do you see things in a sort of commercial sense? And then finally, can you illustrate your interest in the firm? This is a measure for the firm in some sense of the likelihood of that they'll retain you, that you'll grow with the firm and really add value to clients, be profitable for them. So if you can show that you're interested in that firm specifically, it's usually of great interest to the firm. And we have an exercise on our website where you can sort of take inventory of the different competencies that you might bring, and there's a variety of them, and then you can attach some anecdotes to them so that you can really do the storytelling that you need to do in the interview. In the interview, just to give you sort of a baseline, we do expect that most of these will be quite conversational. Law interviews tend not to be driven by hypotheticals. They tend not to be driven by case studies or assessments, right? So you're not going to be asked to write a brief or to analyze a case or to recall a point of law. Typically, they are about your resume. And many attorneys, because this is the way they've interviewed, presumably, are going to ask you quite conversational questions. You might get questions if you've gone to the same alma mater or if you have the same interest. So often students are a little bit disarmed by how conversational the interview is. And on the one hand, that's good. We want you to have a nice rapport with the person. But on the other hand, if you haven't made your case and if you haven't given them a reason to want to hire you, it's not as though you get to relitigate that and go back and say, wait, you didn't ask me the right questions. If you asked me better questions, I would have shown you how I'm a good fit. It's your job, essentially, to package a presentation, an advocacy exercise in a conversational way. So we want you to maintain that tone, but we want you to have some sense of what you want to talk about as well. We do expect that most of the talking will be done by the interviewer. They'll ask you a variety of questions. There may be some rapport building at the beginning. You'll probably be speaking most of the time in response to those questions, but typically toward the end of the interview, there isn't a chance for a question and answer where you get to put questions to them. Sometimes that's embedded into the course of the interview. Sometimes the interviewer says, "What do you want to know?" right off the bat. So there's sort of different formats there, and we want to highlight that this is going to go differently depending on the interviewer and the style that they adopt. We're going to talk a little bit later about some questions that might feel a little bit less conversational. We call those behavioral questions, and how you might address those. So we broke up the world of likely questions, as you'll see in this slide, into these resume type questions and then the behavioral type questions. So Amy and I can illustrate some of those for you. So a rapport building question might be, so I noticed that you were in the marching band. I played the xylophone in the marching band. What instrument did you play?
A open-ended question might be, tell me a little bit about yourself.
A classic open-ended question.
Yes.
There might be a self-evaluating question. What's made you successful?
Future planning. Where do you see yourself in 5 years, and how do you see this position fitting into your overall career plan?
And then, of course, firm specific. You're sitting in front of them. So why this firm? Which practice area this firm interests you? And we're going to talk a little bit about how to unpack some of those practice area interests, right? And then we think there'll be a set of questions that could be behavioral in nature that look and feel a little bit different than this. And we're gonna dive into those a little bit more later. Amy's going to start us off with some basic tips on how to perform well in the interview setting.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, you want to start off by knowing your agenda. And we've talked a little bit about this, the 3-point agenda. Know what you want to sell and know, what you want to get across from the interviewer, and go in there with sort of that agenda in mind. Remember that, as Rob showed you in the beginning with that, I think, very powerful graphic of the busy businessman. It's quite possible that the person who is interviewing you hasn't had much time to take a look at your resume. What we have seen from employers is that, a lot of times the interviewers don't get the resume until right before they go on to interview. And so don't anticipate or don't expect that the person who's interviewing you has spent a significant amount of time on your resume. So, you may find that the interviewer goes straight to your interest section, or starts off with the softball, tell me about yourself, or as Rob says, what do you want to know? And so don't be thrown off about that. Go in there with your agenda and think through how you want to approach the interview. Firms do a lot of training of their interviewers, and in training those interviewers, they really push them to try to get beyond common interests, the rapport building questions that we just went over, but that doesn't always happen. So be prepared to drive the conversation to turn it towards the agenda that you came into the interview with. Make sure that you project enthusiasm, make good eye contact with the interviewer, have a smile on your face, show that you're excited to be there. That's just as important at 9 o'clock in the morning as it is at 5 o'clock p.m. These can be long days for both you and the interviewer, but it's really important to project enthusiasm throughout the process. Empathize. This basically means, understand that the employer is busy, has a lot going on, may or may not have had a lot of time to review your resume. So don't make the interviewer work to get you to talk. Highlight things on your resume that they think that you think could be of interest, or that you want them to pay attention to. And don't be surprised if they ask a lot of open-ended questions as they're reviewing your resume to get to more substance. Explain. This basically means go beyond the short answer. There really is an implied why in every question. So, why do you want to be a litigator? Well, I really enjoy legal research and writing. Tell me a little bit more about why you enjoy legal research and writing, and how can you demonstrate that you have strong legal research and writing skills. So think about how this goes back to your agenda and what you believe are your strongest selling points, and think about how you want to get those points across. Accentuate the positive. Be positive. frame things in a positive manner and show that you've made affirmative decisions rather than default ones. Affirmative basically meaning, not being passive about why you made certain decisions. For example, going to law school, really think about why you want to go to law school and come up with a stronger answer than, oh, I was a Russian studies major and I didn't know what to do with it, so I went to law school. Show that you made an informed, affirmative decision, and ask questions that relate to the employment interview. This you can see in the corner here. We have an exercise. Develop 2 or 3 generally applicable questions based on questions you can ask. What the worst thing that can happen at the end of an interview is for the employer to say, "Do you have any questions for us?" And that your mind is totally blank, or you say, well, no, you've answered everything. You always want to have a couple of questions in your arsenal that you can ask the employer, because it shows that you are interested and that you've done your homework and you've done your research. So take a look at the questions you can ask and come up with a handful of questions that, even if some of your questions might have been asked, or I'm sorry, answered during the course of the interview, it's unlikely that all of them would be. So make sure that you have a handful in your arsenal and that you're prepared when you're asked that question.
And we'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of shaping questions. So the foundational tips are vital, right? But we think that everyone's got the ability to stand out just a bit more. And the premise of this slide is really that, again, so many of the questions that will be asked are knowable to some degree. There's typically a range of the types of questions that employers ask. You should consult the questions you might be asked guide on our website. And if that's the case, then really, to Amy's earlier point, the ability to think about these beforehand, reflect on them, and bullet out certain answers is helpful. So what we want to do to help you stand out is how to think about arranging those answers. And the first piece really is to tell stories. Not to simply overwhelm them with explanation, but to show illustrative stories. Stories tend to stick in people's brains better. Again, during busy days, what are they going to write down on their notepad? What are they going to bring back to crowded committee meetings to determine who gets a callback or who gets an offer? So you want to attach an anecdote to all of the things that you're hoping to portray in the interview. When we say that we want you to start with the headlines, we want you to be mindful of not simply defaulting to telling a story in chronological order because it's the first time you're thinking of the story. That, again, is the default. But sometimes the key point in a story comes at the end. And in interviewing, as in writing a brief or giving an oral argument, you want to start with your best argument first, and you want them to remember that. So when you think of the answer that you might want to give, for instance, why did you go to law school? If the answer at the end of a long chronology is that you were a paralegal very recently and it really solidified that interest, let's put that at the beginning. And then you can backfill with chronology, with narrative as you need to. Since I was a little kid, I liked arguing and whatever. That's not really the crux of the story. So you want to start with the headlines, because your interviewer, who doesn't have a lot of potentially attention span or know where you're going, we want them to know what you're saying right up front. In the similar vein, sometimes answers get complicated or have multiple elements to them. You can think of, why do you want to work at this firm? Right? Instead of sort of rattling off a litany of factors about the firm, try grouping that a little bit to show the interviewer that you've done some homework and to make it easier for the interviewer to follow where you're going. She might think, wow, there's a lot of reasons here. I'm not sure when this candidate is going to stop giving me reasons. But if you're road mapping, first this and then that, or I'm interested in 2 things about your firm broadly, the practice strength and your promotion of diversity, well, those are buckets that the attorney can then follow a little bit easier. So if your answers are running long as you practice and reflect, think about how you can roadmap them. At any point in an interview, you want to be able to have a bit of a safety valve in case you get into uncertain terrain. So here, when we tell you to get to the high ground, what we mean is, what is your safety valve? What do you feel strongest about in the interview? Maybe it's your knowledge of the firm or your passion for working there. Maybe it's some of the pre-law experience that you've had. And we want you to think of creative ways that you can get back to those things. So even if you get asked an uncomfortable question about an experience, when can you pivot and weave back to high ground that makes you feel a little bit more comfortable? Now, you can't look evasive, so this just shouldn't be a strategy that you use for every answer, but we do want you to have a sense of what's more comfortable for you to be talking about. And then finally, this is always going to be the case in interpersonal communication, that people are speaking even when they're not speaking, right? Their body language tells you something. It's a little bit harder to read on Zoom, because we're looking at a camera sometimes we're looking at the person. We think you should be putting the person's um, tile, their sort of video screen, as close to your camera as possible so you can look at the person and it seems like you're looking into the camera. That way you can read the person's body language a little bit. Do they seem disinterested? Do they seem like they're not listening very much? It can give you clues about where you need to go with your answer. So that's a really important piece too. And it's just a little bit more of a challenge, I'd say, on a virtual platform, but it's something we're all going to have to deal with. Okay, so we do want you to ask good questions. It's a key part of the interview, as Amy was saying. We said earlier in that advice piece that we want you to have 2 or 3 at the ready. 3 or 4 is not going to hurt in this environment. And that doesn't mean that you ask the same stock question all the time, but sort of 3 or 4 concepts or themes or types of questions that you like to volley at the person, but they will vary. Now, often when we work with students, they say, well, I'll know what questions I ask when I see the attorney bio. I'll ask based on that. And I understand the desire to particularize your questions, but a couple of thoughts about that. Remember that at any point your interviewer may change. People are swapping in constantly during busy times, especially high volume times like OCI. So pegging all of your questions to a particular interview could be a challenge. We also want you to remember that this isn't an informational meeting. The goal of an informational meeting is to really uncover maybe what that attorney did in their career and how you might model your career after it if it's of interest to you. But in a job interview, you're trying to pitch how you'll be a good member of the team and why they should hire you. It's a bit of a different exercise. So pegging all of your questions to their bio is risky for a few reasons. Additionally, you don't have any control over who's interviewing you, especially at the OCI stage. So if you're, tried and true M&A lawyer that, that's your plan, and you're meeting with the senior environmental litigator, I don't think you want to explore their bio in a particular depth because it's really not going to resonate with whatever you've expressed to have an interest in at the firm. So we want you to go a little bit beyond that just desire to ask about the bio and not turn this into an informational meeting. And then another point we like to make is, be mindful of when you're asking good questions. There's always a range of great questions students want to ask about. But sometimes the 20-minute screener or even the more prolonged callback isn't the right time to ask a probative question. It might not be the right person sitting across from you. It just might not be the right time in terms of marketing your interest in the firm and getting an offer. So what we want you to know is that there will be time after an offer comes in, should you get one, to ask the probative question. Now, if you don't get the offer, the probative question's moot anyway, right? So you have the time when it's most relevant to ask the really hard questions, and often you can design the slate of people you ask those questions to. So as important as what questions you ask is when you ask them. And we really think that the safest route in a screening interview and indeed to some level of a callback is to ask questions that really show your interest in the firm, your research in the firm, and your desire to contribute. So the topics might include training and development, mentorship, how attorneys receive assignments, culture, diversity. And you might say, well, I know some of these things. They've been, promoted on the website, or I've talked to attorneys already. And that's slightly beside the point, because again, the goal here is to show that you've been thinking about them, that they're important to you, and that they single out the firm for particular interest because of what the firm has done around those topics. So even if you've talked about mentorship before, you might say, oh, I've researched some mentorship and I've talked to some of your attorneys, but tell me, have you undertaken the formal mentorship program here? Or has it been, in your experience, a little bit more informal in terms of how the mentors have helped your career? Because then you're at the intersection of this Venn diagram about your interest in working in the firm and your interest in their experience at the firm. That's where you want to be. So we want to design questions that really get at that intersection. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what the interview might look like. What are some common pitfalls we've seen in working with students and talking to attorneys about their reactions? And I think the first one sometimes is a bit of a practice area trap. Students might feel like they need to have absolute knowledge of what practice area they want to be in. We don't think that's the standard at all. At the same time, you can't be indifferent. So you can be undecided, but indifference doesn't look very attractive to the employer. Remember, they're going to pay you a lot of money and invest a lot of you in terms of training. So to just sort of seem like a tourist who wants to try a lot of practice areas might not be very compelling to them. How do you neutralize that? Show that you're thoughtful. Show that you've done some thinking and some homework about the practice area and why you might fit. What are some features of the practice, broadly speaking, that resonate with you, and why do you think you'd add value? be wary that there are some niche practice areas that the firm may advertise on its website, but really not hire into in great droves, or maybe even be profitable for the firm in any substantial way. So things like art law, appellate law, sports law, other niche practices that may not be indigenous to a particular geography. It can be a bit of a risky proposition to say that that's all you want to do at the firm, because the practice may not make a lot of money for the firm, or they may not do a lot of hiring into it. So if you're guns blazing about a very narrow practice area, it can be a challenge for the firm to slot you in. So what we offer students often is, it's not that you can't say that you have an interest in that, but can you scope out slightly and say that you might have a particular interest in sports law, but you're also drawn to the firm for the adjacent practices like labor law, like antitrust law, like mergers and acquisitions, and you'd be more than happy to work in those until some sports law work became available. It's a bit of a safer approach if you have a really strong interest in a niche practice area. And then finally, something that we see often is just asserting a broad interest in international law. And this is not specifically a practice area at firms, right? There are many aspects and tentacles to international law. Do you want to work abroad in a foreign office? Do you want to work in the United States on legal issues that have an international valence? Do you want to work in the United States on clients from overseas? So really try to unpack that, from cross-border transactions to international trade, to international arbitration, to Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. There's a lot of practices out there with an international valence. So do try to put a little more flesh on the bones of that before you go in sort of asserting the interest. Okay, so another pitfall before I turn it over to Amy. Students are often a little bit trepidatious about grades in certain environments. And I think the first question you want to ask yourself is, are my grades going to likely be an issue in this interview? We have some pretty robust grade history to show you where the trends are for firms in terms of how they hire. So the first thing you want to ask yourself is, should grades be a concern in this room? Because if you have some sense of how the firm hires, maybe they're a concern for you in a certain room, but not in another, right? So ask yourself that. You might want to think about, before you dive into the topic of grades, what the role of just a very challenging 2020 has been. Of course, spring had no grades for everybody, but those challenges that led to that policy at Georgetown and so many other schools may have carried over for you into the fall when you did have grades. So there may have been a challenge health-wise for you, for friends or family. You may have suffered some direct or indirect trauma from the political and social unrest that our country experienced. It may have just been a significant challenge learning by Zoom. It certainly has been for many of students that I've talked to. So no matter the challenge in terms of how you may have performed with grades, I think they can be acknowledged. But at the end of the day, we do think the employer is going to want to focus more on how you adapted, how you overcame the challenge, than on the particular challenge itself. So do some reflecting on anything you were able to do to rise above those challenges. So, the third step in thinking about this, okay, so if you were inclined to raise the grade, you think it's the right room and you've got something to say, how do you say it? Because it's not at all certain that the employer is going to ask you point blank about your grades. They may not want to wade into that uncomfortable territory with you. So if they don't, and you think it's part of your advocacy piece to sort of overcome this grades issue, how do you do it? And we think it's a challenge to walk in and it's the first thing you say. It might anchor them in a negative way or make you look defensive. We also think it's a challenge for it to be the last thing you say. And that's what they remember maybe perhaps most about the interview. So the strategy that we like is to weave it into an answer where they ask you one thing, you give them some of an answer to that, you weave in the issue about grades, and you spin out in a positive way. So for instance, how'd you like Georgetown? It's been terrific. The professors are great. I've really enjoyed my classes and my classmates, but the online format has been a challenge, and I think I would have performed better. So some of the grades I received as a 2L may not have been as strong as when I was a 1L, and I think a lot of that had to do with the online format, but I'm working hard. I'm talking to professors. I'm owning that, and I think I'm in a place to do better next semester. I'm really excited to be taking XYZ class or have XYZ externship, right? Positive, acknowledge the challenge, back into positive at the end. And other things you may focus on in sort of using that strategy, tell them how well you understood the material. It could be, if where possible, is your performance in a relevant class strong. So if you want to do national trade and you got a really great grade in national trade, let's spend a lot of time there in terms of grades and aptitude. You can talk about your resilience, your grit, your desire to improve and get better. Or you can just advert to other areas that show a competence, pre-law, externships over the summer to really neutralize that. At the end of the day, it's a pretty personal approach. So do talk to your advisor, raise this in any mock interviews you're doing with us to come up with the best approach for yourself. Amy's going to talk about a somewhat related issue about extenuating circumstances.
Yes, and I just want to piggyback on something that Rob mentioned at the conclusion of that last slide, raising some of these pitfall issues with your advisor, your mock interviewer. If you do a mock interview with an advisor in OCS or grad programs, I would suggest reaching out to the advisor that you're assigned to ahead of time when you send along your resume, and just share with that advisor some of the things that you want to make sure that he or she asks you during the course of the practice interview. That way you can be sure that the interview that you're getting with the advisor sort of hits on all the points that you want to make sure that you practice before you go into your actual interviews. And I know for myself, when I'm doing practice interviews, that's a question that I always ask at the beginning. What are there certain things you want to make sure that I ask you and you want to have practice addressing? So I just want to highlight that that's something that you might want to consider doing before your practice interviews. But yes, we're going to talk about extenuating circumstances here, kind of piggybacking on the last slide with regards to 2020 and just how hard law school is. Sometimes that results in needing to take time off, needing to take a leave of absence, or sometimes students have illnesses and they need to take time away, and sometimes they withdraw from classes. And so instead of a grade, there's a withdrawal. So, if that's the case for you, what we would encourage you to do is, again, come in and talk to your advisor about how to handle potential questions that you might get. Things that you might consider in crafting an answer are, what's the reason for the extenuating circumstances? Do you feel comfortable talking about the reason? How prolonged was your absence, and how many withdrawals did you have to take? Are there other plus factors that you can highlight and to turn the attention away from the fact that you took a leave or that you had to withdraw due to illness? Or is it relevant to what the employer does? And then talk through with your advisor, how to handle those questions and how to overcome any concerns that the employer may have. Really, what you want to show the employer is that, if you had to take a leave of absence or if you had to withdraw, it's really not worth focusing on. That that you've moved on from that. You've come back. You are dedicated to law school. You're eager to learn, and you're very excited to go and work for the firm. Again, practice is really important here because you want to be comfortable with your answer so that you come across as confident, and that confidence will help the employer understand and believe that this truly is something that you've moved on from and not something that they need to be worried about at all.
So another area that can sometimes be challenging, questions that are illegal or border on the inappropriate, border on the illegal or are inappropriate. We think these are exceedingly rare. And the thousands of interviews that get conducted over the course of OCI, we don't get a lot of this, or a lot of this raised to our level. But it could happen. Illegal questions, the questions that touch on protected class, so race, gender, sexuality, things like that really have no place in these conversations. So do elevate that to us if you see them. There may be questions that are hard questions that skirt the line between appropriate and inappropriate, and those are a little bit tougher to see. I've been on the receiving end of very tough interview questions, sort of gruffly said, very terse, and they just wanted to get right to the kernel of the issue and not make nice. That's unfortunate. We don't know if that rises to the level of problematic, but there are certain questions that then border over into inappropriate. So it's a little bit of a it when you see it kind of thing. But a rubric sort of for thinking through how to handle these. First, how do you feel about the question? If it's something that you think you can answer or sort of neutralize the underlying concern about, maybe you do take a shot at answering it. Again, what might you say to that is really trying to get at what seems to be underlying the question or the concern. So do your best gamely in the moment if it's possible, but please know that we're here to handle these things. We have open dialogues with many firms. Firms don't want to see this kind of behavior on campus. They think it's not only unfair to students and unfortunate, just really bad for business. So they want to root it out whenever possible. And we do have experience handling these, again, exceedingly rare, but they do come up. Please know that we're here to support you as they do. We had promised and dangled earlier that we're going to talk about this other type of interview question that you may see. It's the behavioral question. The telltale sign of a behavioral question is they say, tell me about a time when. And the notion behind a behavioral question is that the past experience that you've had doing something or going through something predicts how you'll behave in the future. So in that way, the firm is getting a good sense of what you'll be like on the job. There's a technique for unpacking this. It's contained in a guide that I'll link you to in a moment, but it's called the START strategy. And broadly speaking, what you want to be doing is thinking through the situation, describing it for the person that you're talking to, dive into the task a little bit that you had in front of you. What action steps did you take? At this point, it's really critical to be using I statements, not broad generic statements, not here's what we did, but unpacking the I behind the actions. Describe the result that was obtained, and then critically, transferable. How will you transfer this to success, or how will you transfer this insight into your future behavior, right? So we have, again, an exercise in terms of practicing that. We think the kinds of questions you might be asked at that have a behavioral quality to them are really around these topics: teamwork, hard work, time management, entrepreneurship, owning and really running a project, or taking a problem on as your own. And then broadly speaking, communication, but especially cross-cultural communication, which is increasingly important at these firms. So we don't want you to be caught off guard. We don't think it'll be a huge part of the diet that you have in these interviews, but it certainly is something that you should be comfortable with and familiar with. So Amy, as we near the end here, what to expect after the interview?
Yeah, so after the interview, the first thing that you're going to want to do is take a few minutes to write down some notes about the interview. Who did you interview with? What was the name of the interviewer? What were some of the things that you talked about? What are some of the things that you in your answers highlighted? And what are some things that, if you get a call back, you want to make sure that you have the chance to address? How did you feel after the interview? What was your impression of the firm and the interviewer? What were some questions that you want to have the chance to ask if you have a callback? This way that, if you do end up getting a callback interview, you're already prepared by knowing who you interviewed with before and what are some of the things that you want to make sure that you address in the callback. Thank you notes. You do not need to send them for OCI screeners. In fact, the employers don't want you to send them for OCI screeners. As we mentioned before, a lot of these attorneys are super busy and getting hundreds of emails a day. And so they do not want to be receiving thank you notes from all the students with whom they interviewed over the course of the day. But they are suggested and in fact encouraged for any interviews that happen sort of outside of the Georgetown screening interview process. So if you get asked to interview outside of OCI, or if you get invited to a callback, we do encourage and strongly suggest that you write thank you emails. One word to the wise here: make sure those thank you emails are proofread and error-free. And if you can, this is where the taking notes aspect really is helpful. If you can, try to personalize the email to each interviewer that you had. This is particularly true, in a callback where you're interviewing with 6 or 7 possibly different people. You don't want to send them all the exact same thank you notes. So take some time, reflect back on your notes, reflect back on what you talked about, and personalize the thank you notes. Do not send group thank you notes. Don't send one thank you note to all of your interviewers. Send one to each of the people that you interviewed with. And again, email is totally appropriate. The next stage of the interview process is the callback stage. And so if you are successful in your screening interview and the firm thinks that you're a good fit and you find that you're a good fit for them, you may be invited to and accept a callback interview. Unlike the screening interview where it's one or two interviewers for each firm spending 20 minutes talking with you about the firm, it's a very it's a very short period of time. There's not a lot of opportunity to get into a lot of depth in that 20 minutes. The callback interview is different. That's the next stage. That's where you're probably interviewing with at least four, maybe, 5, 6, 7 attorneys over the course of a couple of hours. And, there is going to be an expectation at the callback stage that you have a real strong sense of why you want to work there, what you bring to the table, how you're unique. And we will help you prepare for your callbacks and go over questions. There's no magic sauce to preparing for a callback that's distinctly different from preparing for a screening interview. But unlike screening interviews where you may have 12, 15 of those over the course of OCI, you're probably going to have fewer callbacks. And so the expectation in terms of your preparedness and your interest in and focus on the firm is raised. So we do have callback materials on our website, and we'll be happy to answer callback questions as we get a little bit closer to that stage in the process. And then follow up. This is always something that students have questions about because after OCI, it may take some time before you hear from a particular firm that you're interested in. If you have questions about if, when, and how to follow up, talk to your advisor. And we all talk to employers constantly. We have friends who are recruiters. We are in constant contact with our counterparts at law firms, and so a lot of times we have intelligence from our counterparts about where they are in the evaluating process. So if you have questions about following up, please feel free to check in with us. We suggest as a general rule the idea of polite persistence. It's fine to follow up if it's been a reasonable amount of time, but you want to be sensitive to the volume of applicants that these firms are dealing with, and be sensitive to the amount of work on their plate before following up with recruiters and attorneys. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to talk to an advisor.
And we'll be pushing out to you more guidance on how and when to follow up closer to the time there. So it's something you don't need in your brain right now. We wanted you to be aware of it. A little bit more, Amy, on what happens after.
Yeah, so this slide talks a little bit about callback offer timing. Callbacks typically happen quickly, but not always. And once you have a callback, then comes the opportunity to hopefully get an offer. And so, we encourage students to not hold open more than 5 offers at a time. In fact, we encourage students to hold open only 3 offers if you're looking at one market. And we suggest that students make a decision as expeditiously as possible. And this limit and the encouragement to make a decision as early as possible is really to benefit to your classmates who may be waiting to hear from a firm that you just frankly aren't as interested in as other offers that you may have received. So try to only hold, so to speak, as many offers as you are truly and sincerely interested in. And again, your advisor is here to discuss the pros and cons of all the offers that you have and help you sort of go through the decision-making process of winnowing down that group of offers. If you're in the fortunate position of having more than one to consider. We have asked employers to give students at Georgetown at least 14 days to decide on an offer that they've at least 14 days from the start of OCI or the date of the offer letter to decide on an offer that they have received. And so this is in an effort to enable you to have as much information as possible before making a decision. If it may be that 14 days have gone by and you have to make a decision on an offer where you've not yet heard from some of the other firms that you've done callbacks with. If that's the case, we encourage you to come and talk to an advisor about potentially asking for an extension and how to do that appropriately.
Great. And ideally, you'd ask for the extension before that 14th day, but again, more information coming to that in real time when you'll need it. And there's more information on our site there. So the final notes to close with, a little bit of OCI interviewing etiquette. Show up. This is such an easy one, right? Go to all the meetings that you are supposed to be at. Hopefully this is easier than ever as you can do it remotely and just log in. Of course, things come up and urgent circumstances arise, so communication is going to be vital here. We're going to give you lots of information about how to stay in touch with us should those urgent situations arise. But please do show up. There's no trading of interviews or anything like that. You should go to the interview that you're assigned to and do your best job at that interview. You should be in professional attire. So this is suits, business attire. Certainly on the top where they can see you in the screen, but we think the bottom as well. That helps first with just mindset of feeling like you're in a professional environment. But second, you don't know if you might have to get up and do something around the room. The cat comes in or a child comes in, you have to plug in the computer and you don't want to have pajama pants or sweats for everyone to see. So do dress the part fully. Amy mentioned this earlier, but making sure you're quieting devices that don't need to be given alerts so that you're not distracted and you don't distract the interviewer is important. And then finally, professionalism in the interview, the graciousness with which you greet them, the enthusiasm, you want to anchor a positive bias when they see you, but also after the fact. So checking your email and responding to emails in a timely way, typically within one business day. Make sure that the voicemail message that you have is a professional one, where you announce your name and say that you can leave a message. If you're not in a position to answer the phone for whatever reason at the moment, it's just not a good time to take a business call, that's okay. Let it go to voicemail, listen to the voicemail, respond as promptly as possible. When you pick up the phone and you do get somebody, announce your name, hello, this is, before you start talking, because they're creating, you're creating a thing you were saying, a brand throughout this, and you want to be as professional as possible throughout. We know it's a lot of information. We're here to support you for the questions that sort of fall between the cracks and what we've presented. We wish you good luck. We know it's a stressful time. And again, please feel free to ask us questions as they come up. Thanks so much.